Annabelle Miller never expected that a black CEO would walk into her tiny bookshop and make her question everything she thought she knew about desire. But watching Jack Martin's perfectly manicured fingers trace the spine of a first-edition Langston Hughes made her forget every financial worry and focus entirely on how those same hands might feel against her skin. The late afternoon sun streamed through dusty windows, casting golden light across cramped shelves that held more dreams than dumped profit. But Annabelle couldn't focus on inventory. When this man moved through her poetry section with the kind of reverent attention she'd only dreamed someone might show her body. His expensive charcoal suit looked wildly out of place among her second-hand furniture and peeling paint. Yet he examined each volume with genuine appreciation rather than the condescending browsing she'd come to expect from well-dressed customers. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Do you have any recommendations for contemporary black poets? Something that builds on Hughes's foundation but speaks to modern experience?" The question caught her off guard. Most customers asking for poetry recommendations wanted dead white men or greeting card verses. When she moved closer to show him the contemporary section, their fingers brushed as she reached for a volume of Terence Hayes, and electricity shot through her with startling intensity that made her breath catch audibly. "This one explores identity and masculinity in ways that would make Hughes proud," she managed, hyper-aware that her vintage sundress had shifted to reveal more thigh than professional consultation typically warranted. The way Jack's dark eyes flickered downward before returning to her face with deliberate restraint made heat pool low in her belly. "You seem to know poetry well," he observed, accepting the book with careful attention to avoid another accidental touch that they both clearly wanted. "Do you write as well as curate?" Annabelle's laugh carried undertones of bitterness she couldn't quite suppress. "I used to dream about writing. Now I mostly dream about paying rent." The confession slipped out before her professional mask could stop it, revealing the desperation that made every interaction feel loaded with possibility and danger. Jack studied her with increasing interest, his gaze moving from her flushed cheeks to the way her dress clung to curves that suddenly felt hypersensitive under his attention. When he stepped closer under the pretense of examining another book, she caught his scent-expensive cologne mixed with something essentially masculine that made her want to press her face against his throat and breathe deeply. The eviction notice tucked behind her register seemed to mock her growing arousal, reminding her that attraction to obviously wealthy men had always led to disappointment. But the way Jack handled her books with genuine reverence, combined with the heat building between them in her cramped sanctuary, made Annabelle wonder if some risks might finally be worth taking. The bookshop felt different after closing. Shadows pooling between shelves while amber lamplight transformed familiar spaces into something intimate and dangerous. But Annabelle couldn't shake the feeling that Jack Martin's lingering presence carried secrets that would change everything she thought she understood about their afternoon encounter. "I should mention something," Jack said, his voice carrying undertones that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and dread. He'd stayed past closing without her asking, helping shelve returns with hands that moved across book spines like they belonged in her space. "My interest in your shop isn't entirely literary." Annabelle paused in counting the day's meager receipts, her body responding to his proximity despite warning bells that rang louder with each word. "What do you mean?" "I'm CEO of Martin Development Group," he said quietly, watching her face with careful attention. "We're considering purchasing this building." The words hit her like cold water, transforming afternoon attraction into something that felt calculated and predatory. Every gentle touch, every appreciative glance at her books, every moment of connection suddenly felt like manipulation designed to soften her resistance to inevitable displacement. "You bastard," she whispered, fury and betrayal making her voice shake. You came here to scout your next demolition project, not to buy poetry." "That's not how it started," Jack said, moving closer despite her obvious anger. "The attraction between us has nothing to do with business. Everything has to do with business when you're talking about destroying my life." Annabelle shot back, her hands trembling as she faced him with righteous fury that couldn't quite erase the heat building. Between them, this shop is all I have left. When Jack reached for her, she meant to push him away, but her hands fisted in his expensive shirt instead, pulling him closer with desperate hunger that had everything to do with knowing this might be her only chance to claim something from the man who could destroy her dreams. Their mouths collided with bruising intensity, teeth and tongues and breathless need that pressed her back against the poetry shelf, his hands tangled in her blonde hair while hers worked frantically at his suit jacket, both of them lost in passion that felt like claiming and surrendering simultaneously. When his mouth found her throat, she arched against him with abandon that would have scandalized her rational mind. "Miss Miller." The landlord's voice cut through their desperate encounter like a blade, making them spring apart with guilty haste. "We need to discuss your situation." Standing in her bookshop's intimate lighting with swollen lips and disheveled hair, Annabelle realized that wanting Jack Martin might be the most dangerous desire she'd ever experienced. The eviction notice in the landlord's hand suddenly felt like prophecy rather than threat, while Jack's presence transformed from salvation into the very force that could complete her destruction. Annabelle's cramped apartment above the bookshop felt like a confession booth the morning after, all exposed brick and second-hand furniture that couldn't hide the desperate reality of someone living paycheck to paycheck. But lying in her narrow bed with sunlight streaming through threadbare curtains, she couldn't stop replaying the way Jack Martin's hands had felt tangled in her hair before her landlord's interruption transformed desire into humiliation. The eviction notice sat on her kitchen table like a death sentence. 30 days to find money she didn't have or lose everything she'd built from nothing. Her body still burned with frustrated need from their interrupted encounter, every nerve ending alive with memories of his mouth against her throat and the hard press of his arousal through expensive fabric when her hand slipped beneath the thin cotton of her oversized t-shirt. She tried to imagine anonymous touch rather than specific fingers, but Jack's dark eyes and reverent way of handling her books had branded themselves into her fantasies. Her breathing quickened as she touched herself with desperate efficiency, seeking release that might clear her head enough to think rationally about impossible choices. The sharp knock on her door made her freeze with her hand still between her thighs, pulse hammering as she recognized Jack's voice calling her name through thin wood that provided no real privacy. She grabbed a robe that barely covered her thighs, her body flushed and sensitive as she opened the door to find him standing in her hallway with coffee and what looked suspiciously like an apology. "We need to talk," Jack said, his eyes taking in her disheveled state with heat that made her acutely aware of how little the silk robe concealed. "About last night, about the building, about what happens next." "There's nothing to discuss," Annabelle managed, stepping back to let him into her tiny living space that suddenly felt even more cramped with his presence, filling it. "You're going to destroy my shop, and I'm going to lose everything I've worked for." Jack's gaze moved across her sparse apartment with careful attention, taking in the stack of overdue bills, the empty refrigerator visible through the open kitchen, the reality of someone barely surviving despite working every day. When his eyes returned to her face, they held understanding that felt more dangerous than desire. "The development isn't final," he said quietly, moving closer despite the obvious tension between them. "There might be alternatives we haven't considered." The way he said alternatives while looking at her barely covered body made heat pool low in her belly, even as her rational mind screamed warnings about trusting men who held her future in their hands. Standing in her threadbare robe with Jack Martin in her private space, Annabelle realized that some temptations felt impossible to resist, even when accepting them might cost everything she had left to lose. The restaurant felt like theater designed for seduction. All crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths that cost more than Annabelle's monthly grocery budget. But watching Jack Martin command respect from servers who probably earned more than she did made her realize that his wealth wasn't just comfortable. It was the kind of power that could reshape entire city blocks without breaking stride. "The Dover soul is exceptional here," Jack said, his hand resting possessively on her lower back as the Mater D led them to a corner table that offered privacy worth more than most people's rent. The dress he'd sent that morning, emerald silk that fit like it had been made for her body, felt like armor and vulnerability simultaneously. His business associates arrived during the second course, men in suits that screamed corporate dominance while they discussed development projects with casual authority that made Annabelle's bookshop sound like a minor inconvenience rather than her entire life. She listened to them reshape neighborhoods with the same ease they ordered wine, each decision affecting hundreds of lives without apparent consideration for human cost. Martin Development's portfolio includes most of the waterfront district, explained Harrison Wells, his silver hair and predatory smile making Annabelle feel like prey being evaluated for future consumption. Jack's vision for downtown revitalization has attracted international attention. The way they spoke about displacement as revitalization made her stomach turn. Even as Jack's thumb traced circles on her wrist with intimate attention that sent heat pooling between her thighs despite her growing unease. When he excused himself to take a business call, his associate's conversation revealed the true scope of his influence over her city's future. "Excuse me?" Annabelle murmured, needing space to process the magnitude of what she'd gotten involved with. The restaurant's bathroom felt like sanctuary until Jack appeared behind her, his reflection in the mirror making her pulse quicken with dangerous recognition. "You looked overwhelmed," he said, moving closer until his chest pressed against her back while his hands settled on her hips with possessive certainty. "This is who you really are," she whispered, meeting his eyes in the mirror while his touch made her arch against him despite her confusion. "Someone who destroys communities for profit." "I'm someone who wants you," Jack replied, his mouth finding her throat while his hands worked beneath the expensive silk he'd provided. The contradiction between his gentle touch and the power he wielded made her desperate for connection that felt authentic rather than calculated. Their encounter was fierce and claiming, marked by urgency that spoke of stolen moments rather than genuine intimacy. When they returned to the table with flushed cheeks and careful composure, Annabelle realized that wanting Jack Martin meant accepting a world where her desires might be the very thing that destroyed everything she'd tried to protect. The private auction house felt like a cathedral dedicated to inherited privilege. All mahogany panels and hushed voices discussing acquisitions that cost more than most people's houses. But watching Jack Martin bid $30,000 on a first edition Whitman with casual indifference made Annabelle realize she'd been playing in a league where her entire bookshop was worth less than his evening's entertainment. "The Dickinson manuscripts are particularly exquisite," murmured Mrs. Pemberton, her diamonds catching light as she appraised Annabelle with the same calculating attention she'd shown the rare books. "Jack has such refined taste in ... collections." "Oh." The way she said collections while looking directly at Annabelle made it clear that she was being evaluated as Jack's latest acquisition, rather than recognized as someone with her own expertise. When other collectors discussed literary merit with casual authority that dismissed her contributions, she felt like an exotic accessory rather than an equal participant in conversations about books she'd studied her entire life. "The provenance on Lot 47 is questionable," Annabelle observed quietly, recognizing forgery techniques that these wealthy collectors seemed willing to overlook for the sake of Prestigious ownership. Jack's hand tightened possessively on her waist as conversations continued around them without acknowledging her observation. His touch both protective and controlling in ways that made her skin burn with frustrated need. When he excused himself to examine lots in the private viewing room, she followed with dangerous determination that had everything to do with reclaiming power and nothing to do with literary appreciation. "You brought me here to show off your wealth," she said, once they were alone among priceless manuscripts, her voice carrying anger that masked deeper hurt. "Not because you value my knowledge. Brought you because I want you in every part of my life," Jack replied. But his words felt hollow when measured against the evening's evidence of how little her expertise mattered in his world. Annabelle stepped closer with predatory intent that transformed her from decorative accessory into someone who could claim what she wanted without permission. When she pressed him against the display case with aggressive hunger, her mouth finding his with bruising intensity, she felt power returning through sexuality that demanded recognition rather than requesting it. Their encounter was fierce and public enough to be dangerous, her hands working his clothes with bold efficiency while his desperate responses proved that desire could transcend social inequality even when respect couldn't. When footsteps in the hallway forced them apart with guilty haste, Annabelle realized that wanting Jack Martin meant accepting a world where her mind mattered less than her body, standing among literary treasures worth millions while straightening clothes that suddenly felt like costume rather than armor. She understood that some relationships required losing yourself to find connection that might not be worth the sacrifice. Jack's penthouse felt like a sanctuary suspended above the city's chaos. All floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture that spoke of wealth earned rather than inherited, but the photograph of a young black boy reading in what looked like a public library made Annabelle realized that his drive for success carried personal history she'd never considered. "That's me at 8, Jack said, following her gaze to the framed image while Seattle's skyline glittered below them like scattered diamonds. The Garfield Branch Library. I spent every afternoon there because it was safer than going home to my father's drunken rages." The revelation hit her with unexpected force, transforming her assumptions about privilege and power into something more complex than simple wealth accumulation. When he poured wine that probably cost more than her weekly earnings, his hands carried the careful precision of someone who'd learned to value beautiful things through scarcity rather than abundance. "Books saved my life," he continued, settling beside her on leather furniture that felt luxurious rather than ostentatious. "Not just the escape they provided, but the knowledge that there were worlds beyond what I was living in. I swore I'd never let anyone destroy places that offered that kind of salvation." The words reframed everything she thought she understood about his interest in her bookshop, making his development plans feel less like corporate greed and more like personal mission. When their eyes met, she saw vulnerability that had nothing to do with business calculations and everything to do with someone who understood the sacred nature of literary sanctuary. "Show me," she whispered, moving closer with hunger that transcended physical desire. "Show me who you really are." Their kiss was different this time, deeper, more honest, marked by recognition rather than conquest. When Jack lifted her against him, carrying her to his bedroom with reverent attention, Annabelle felt herself surrendering not just her body, but her carefully guarded heart to someone who might actually understand what mattered most to her. Their lovemaking was slow and claiming, hands exploring territory made sacred through emotional connection rather than mere physical attraction. Jack worshipped her with patient intensity that made every touch feel like promise and confession, his mouth tracing paths across skin that had never felt so precious or desired. When she rode him with abandonment, that would have terrified her former self, Annabelle discovered that vulnerability could be strength when shared with someone worthy of trust. Their climax felt like foundation, rather than conquest, to people building something authentic from honest materials. Lying afterward in his arms, while city lights painted patterns across walls that had witnessed his transformation from frightened boy to powerful man, Annabelle realized that loving Jack Martin might be the most dangerous and necessary risk she'd ever taken. The future felt suddenly possible in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with finding someone who understood the true value of dreams. The bookshop felt like a war room disguised as literary sanctuary, all mismatched chairs and passionate voices as neighborhood residents gathered to plan resistance against Martin Development's acquisition. But Annabelle couldn't focus on community organizing when her body still burned with memories of Jack's reverent touch and the way he'd whispered her name like prayer in his penthouse bedroom. "They're planning to demolish 6 blocks for luxury condos," announced Rosa Martinez, her weathered hands gesturing toward plans that would erase decades of community history. Mrs. Chen's restaurant, the community center, all of it gone so rich people can have better views. The familiar faces surrounding Annabelle represented everything she'd fought to preserve alive: Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught her to love poetry; young Marcus, whose mother worked 3 jobs to keep him in after-school programs; family's hood built lives in affordable spaces that developers saw as obstacles rather than homes. Their trust in her felt heavier than any financial pressure. "We need someone on the inside," suggested David Kim, his carpenter's hands rough from honest labor. "Someone who might understand their weaknesses." The way they looked at her with desperate hope made guilt twist in her stomach like poison, because she'd become exactly the kind of insider they needed while falling for the man who threatened everything they were trying to protect. When Jack's familiar knock echoed through the shop, the room fell silent with suspicious recognition. "I can explain," Annabelle whispered to her friends, but their expressions had already shifted from trust to betrayal as Jack entered, wearing expensive casual clothes that announced his wealth more effectively than any suit. After awkward introductions and hostile departures, Annabelle found herself alone with Jack in spaces that suddenly felt contaminated by divided loyalties. When he pulled her against him with familiar hunger, her body responded despite her mind's protests about the timing and appropriateness of desire during community crisis. "They hate me," Jack said against her throat, his mouth finding sensitive places that made her arch despite her guilt. "And they have every right to." Their encounter was desperate and conflicted, marked by urgency that spoke of stolen pleasure rather than honest connection. When Jack lifted her onto the counter where she conducted business with neighbors who trusted her, Annabelle felt herself fragmenting between the woman who loved him and the community member who should resist everything he represented. "This is wrong," she gasped, even as her hands worked frantically at his clothes, her body demanding satisfaction that her conscience couldn't provide. "My friends are losing their homes because of your company." "Then help me find another way," Jack whispered, his touch making her forget every reason this was impossible. "Help me be better than what they expect." Standing afterward in her bookshop that smelled of community meetings and guilty pleasure, Annabelle realized that loving Jack Martin might require choosing between her heart and her principles. The community center felt like a tribunal disguised as democratic process, all folding chairs and righteous fury as residents demanded answers about Martin Development's plans. But when Jack Martin walked through the doors wearing his expensive armor of corporate authority, Annabelle realized that her secret relationship was about to become public scandal that would destroy every bridge she'd built in this neighborhood. "Mr. Martin," Rosa Martinez announced with theatrical precision, her voice carrying the kind of moral authority that came from fighting gentrification for decades. "How generous of you to finally face the people you're planning to displace." The room erupted in angry voices that transformed. Jack from the tender lover who'd worshipped her body into a symbol of everything these families feared most. Annabelle watched him field accusations with professional composure that felt like betrayal. Each careful response proving that his corporate persona could override personal connection when convenient. The development will bring jobs and economic growth, Jack replied with measured authority that made her stomach turn. Sometimes progress requires difficult decisions. Progress. David Kim stood with Carpenter's fury, his voice shaking with moral outrage. You call destroying our home's progress. When Rose's sharp eyes caught the way Annabelle couldn't meet Jack's gaze, recognition dawned with devastating clarity. Our little bookshop owner seems awfully quiet tonight. Perhaps she has insights about Mr. Martin's character. The accusation hung in air thick with betrayal as every face turned toward Annabelle with dawning understanding. When Jack's eyes met hers across the hostile crowd, she saw resignation that confirmed her worst fears about the impossibility of their situation. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's growing anger. "Just get out." The bookshop felt like a crime scene after the community center exodus. Empty shelves bearing witness to her isolation as Jack returned despite her explicit dismissal. When he found her crying among the poetry books that had brought them together, his presence ignited fury that demanded physical expression rather than verbal resolution. "You chose them over me," she accused, launching herself at him with violence that transformed into desperate hunger before either of them could process the transition. Their encounter was brutal and claiming, marked by teeth and nails and breathless accusations that punctuated frantic coupling against the same shelves where they'd first discovered attraction. "I chose survival," Jack gasped against her mouth while her legs wrapped around him with possessive fury. "I chose keeping my company intact so I could find alternatives." Their climax felt like destruction and absolution to people discovering that love and hate could coexist in the same desperate moment. When neighbors' voices echoed from the street outside, Annabelle realized that some betrayals created wounds too deep for passion to heal. Standing afterward in her violated sanctuary, she understood that choosing Jack Martin meant accepting exile from the only community that had ever felt like home. The legal office felt like an interrogation chamber disguised as professional consultation. All mahogany furniture and leather-bound volumes that reminded Annabelle sickeningly of Jack's penthouse. But when attorney Sarah Chen spread Martin Development's acquisition documents across the conference table, the fine print revealed layers of deception that made her question everything she thought she knew about corporate greed and personal motivation. "Section 12 is particularly interesting," Sarah observed, her finger tracing clauses that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The development timeline includes provisions for historical preservation that most companies wouldn't bother including. Annabelle studied the dense legal language with growing confusion, her assumptions about Jack's destructive intentions crumbling as she discovered mandatory community space requirements and affordable housing quotas that contradicted everything she'd been told about luxury development. When she found specific protections for small businesses, her pulse quickened with dangerous hope. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered, scanning pages that painted a picture of thoughtful urban planning rather than predatory displacement. "Why would a development company voluntarily limit their own profits?" "That's what we're trying to understand," Sarah replied, her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to trust corporate generosity. Either Martin Development is genuinely committed to community preservation, or these documents are elaborate misdirection designed to prevent organized resistance. The bookshop felt different when Annabelle returned with photocopied evidence that challenged every assumption she'd made about Jack's character and intentions. When he appeared at closing time with Chinese takeout and careful distance, his presence created electricity that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with desperate need for truth. "You've been reading our legal filings," Jack observed, noting the scattered papers with resignation that felt authentic rather than calculated. "I wondered when you'd discovered the preservation clauses." "Explain them," Annabelle demanded, moving closer despite her determination to maintain professional distance. "Explain why your company would voluntarily protect the businesses you're supposedly destroying." When Jack reached for her, she should have stepped away, but her body responded to his proximity with hunger that transcended rational thought. Their kiss was investigative rather than passionate, each of them searching for truth through touch that felt more dangerous than any previous encounter. "Some things are more complicated than they appear," Jack murmured against her mouth, his hands threading through her hair with familiar possessiveness. "Some plans require patience and trust." The way he said trust while his body pressed against hers made heat pool low in her belly despite every rational reason to resist. Standing in her bookshop, surrounded by evidence that contradicted her worst fears, Annabelle realized that discovering Jack Martin's true intentions might be more terrifying than accepting his betrayal. Jack's private study felt like a war room dedicated to impossible dreams. All architectural blueprints and community surveys that transformed corporate development into something resembling urban salvation. But when Annabelle burst through the mahogany doors with legal documents clutched in trembling hands, the truth hit her like revelation wrapped in heartbreak. Every assumption she'd made about life, his intentions had been carefully constructed deception designed to protect something far more precious than profit. "The preservation clauses aren't just legal requirements," she announced, her voice shaking as she faced him across plans that showed her bookshop not demolished but expanded, surrounded by affordable housing and community spaces that looked nothing like the luxury development she'd feared. "You've been planning to save the neighborhood all along." Jack's business associates shifted uncomfortably as their carefully guarded secret became exposed, their expressions carrying the resigned authority of people who'd watched their CEO sacrifice millions to preserve something that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. When Harrison Wells began gathering confidential documents with practiced efficiency, the magnitude of what Jack had risked for community preservation became devastatingly clear. "The board doesn't know about the modified plans," Jack admitted, his dark eyes holding exhaustion that spoke of months spent fighting corporate expectations while protecting community trust. "If they discover I've been using development funds for preservation rather than maximum profit, they'll have grounds for removal." The words reframed every hostile encounter, every community meeting, every moment she'd felt torn between desire and loyalty. When Annabelle understood that Jack had allowed himself to be seen as destroyer rather than protector to maintain the element of surprise necessary for actual change, her heart shattered with the weight of his sacrifice. "You let me hate you," she whispered, moving toward him with desperate recognition. "You let everyone hate you to protect something bigger than yourself." Their collision was emotional and physical simultaneously. Months of misunderstanding dissolving into desperate hunger that had nothing to do with sexual need and everything to do with spiritual recognition. When Jack lifted her onto his desk among blueprints that proved his love extended beyond personal desire into community devotion, Annabelle felt herself surrendering not just her body, but every wall she'd built against trusting, powerful men. Their lovemaking was revelation and absolution, marked by tears that had nothing to do with physical pleasure, and everything to do with discovering that authentic love could exist even within systems designed to crush community spirit. When she moved above him with abandonment that reflected complete trust rather than desperate escape, their connection felt like foundation rather than fantasy. "Forgive me," Jack gasped against her throat as they claimed each other with honesty that had taken months to achieve. "Forgive me for making you choose between loving me and protecting them." Standing afterward in his study, surrounded by evidence of his secret preservation plans, Annabelle realized that some revelations changed. Everything you thought you knew about love and sacrifice. The community center felt like a courtroom awaiting verdict. All nervous energy and cautious hope as residents gathered to hear Jack Martin's preservation proposal. But when Annabelle stood beside him, facing neighbors who trusted her before learning about their relationship, she realized that redemption required more courage than any previous confrontation with corporate power or personal desire. The modified development plan preserves all existing businesses while adding affordable housing and expanded community spaces, Jack announced, his voice carrying humble authority rather than corporate dominance as he presented blueprints that showed growth through preservation rather than destruction through displacement. Your bookshop becomes the anchor for a literary district that serves the entire neighborhood. Rosa Martinez studied the architectural plans with suspicious expertise, her weathered hands tracing proposed community gardens and affordable units that looked too generous to be authentic corporate development. When David Kim discovered specifications for subsidized artist studios, the room's hostility began shifting toward cautious recognition that perhaps corporate interests and community needs weren't always mutually exclusive. "Why should we trust you now?" asked Mrs. Patterson, her elderly voice carrying decades of broken promises from developers who'd spoken beautifully before delivering destruction. "Why should we believe this isn't another elaborate deception?" The question hung in air, thick with earned skepticism, until Annabelle stepped forward with legal documents that proved Jack's personal financial sacrifice for community preservation. "Because he's been fighting his own board for months to make this possible," she said quietly. "Because he risked his career to protect something that mattered more than profit." When the vote came, unanimous approval felt like miracle-wrapped. In democratic process, transforming Jack from community enemy into unlikely ally through transparent planning that prioritized people over maximum development returns. The bookshop became celebration headquarters as neighbors who'd once planned resistance began planning renewal instead. "They forgave us," Annabelle whispered against Jack's mouth as renovation plans scattered across surfaces where they'd once made love in guilty secrecy. The space felt transformed already, not just by architectural possibility, but by community acceptance that made their relationship feel sustainable rather than scandalous. Their encounter was celebration and consecration, surrounded by blueprints that promised growth rather than destruction, while neighbors' laughter echoed from the street outside. When Jack lifted her onto the counter where she'd once conducted business in desperate isolation, their connection felt like foundation built on honest materials rather than passionate deception. "Build something beautiful with me," he murmured against her throat as they moved together with joy that transcended physical pleasure. "Build something that serves love and community simultaneously." Their climax felt like beginning rather than conclusion, two people discovering that authentic partnership could create change more powerful than individual sacrifice. Standing afterward in spaces that would soon expand to serve dreams they'd once thought impossible, Annabelle realized that some love stories required community witness to become completely real. The renovated VIC bookshop felt like a cathedral dedicated to community dreams made manifest. All soaring ceilings and natural light that transformed cramped desperation into spacious possibility. But watching Jack Martin read poetry to neighborhood children in the expanded reading nook made Annabelle realize that some love stories required rebuilding everything you thought you knew about success to create something worth celebrating. The grand opening exceeded every projection. Sarah Chen announced with satisfaction that reflected months of careful planning, her architectural firm having transformed preservation into art that served both literary sanctuary and community gathering space. The cafe corner buzzed with conversations between longtime residents and new neighbors who'd moved to the district specifically for its commitment to affordable culture. Annabelle moved through spaces that had been designed around her dreams rather than corporate profit margins. Watching elderly Mrs. Patterson teach poetry workshops beside young mothers whose children played in areas specifically created for literary exploration. When Rosa Martinez approached with gratitude that erased months of community tension, the weight of authentic belonging settled around her shoulders like blessing rather than burden. "You chose well," Rosa said quietly, her eyes tracking Jack's easy interaction with teenagers who'd once viewed him as gentrification personified. He chose well too. Love that serves community always lasts longer than love that serves only itself. The evening celebration gradually transformed into intimate appreciation as neighbors departed with books purchased from shelves that would never again face eviction notices. When Jack found Annabelle among poetry collections that had survived every crisis to become foundation for expanded possibility, his presence created heat that had nothing to do with forbidden attraction and everything to do with mature partnership built on authentic trust. "No regrets?" he asked, pulling her against him with reverent attention that spoke of someone who understood the magnitude of what they'd built together through sacrifice and community. Service rather than individual ambition. Their lovemaking was celebration and homecoming, surrounded by literary treasures that belonged to both personal collection and community resource. When Annabelle moved above him with confidence that reflected complete security rather than desperate escape, their connection felt like culmination of journey rather than stolen moment between impossible circumstances. "Build the next dream with me," she whispered against his mouth as they moved together with joy that transcended physical pleasure to encompass emotional and spiritual satisfaction. "Build something even more beautiful." Their climax felt like foundation and promise to people who discovered that authentic love could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities when guided by principles larger than personal desire. Standing afterward in spaces that served both romantic partnership and neighborhood preservation, Annabelle understood that some happy endings required courage to reimagine what success actually meant. The bookshop would thrive, the community would flourish, and love would continue growing through service that honored both passion and purpose.